So, Dr. Stacey Shell, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Yes. So I'm really excited. So Dr. Shell actually had this series of posts talking about collaborative therapy. And really, it was safety in therapy. So I was thinking, that is such an important topic because people go to therapy in order to feel safe and to heal for different reasons. And if you don't feel safe in the container of the relationship with the therapist, that's kind of problematic. So I really loved what she was doing. And so if you wouldn't mind kind of introduce yourself a little bit, tell us about yourself, your training, and what got you interested in collaborative therapy.
Sure. So I'm a psychologist. I'm in Toronto, Canada, and I've been practicing for 5.5 years now. I'm actually licensed to work with kids and adolescents, and I'm currently doing retraining to get licensed with adults. So I'm in the process of that. How did I get interested in collaborative therapy? That's such a great question. I feel like it's a combination of my own early experiences in therapy when I was young, and then also just my experiences as a therapist early on in my career. So I had a couple of experiences one when I was a kid and one when I was an adolescent, where I actually saw a therapist a couple of times on both occasions, and it was not like, to have words for it now, was not like a safe feeling collaborative space either time. And it really turned me off of therapy for a really long time. I actually didn't go and do my own work until I was in my early 30s. And I have always thought that that probably played a role in it. It's not the whole thing, but it was part of it, I think. And then just early in my career, working with young people who would come in and share experiences that they'd had with previous therapists that were very heartbreaking at times, really hard to hear. And I think I just felt like I had an opportunity often to be work with these kids in a different way and to give them an experience that felt safe and collaborative and where they felt seen and heard and like they had a say in their own work and their own healing. So yeah.
So really empowering, like that's kind of what your message is, like how to empower people to feel so they can show up as themselves in
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so important. I think feeling safe to bring the hard stuff there and to know that it's going to be approached gently and with kindness and gentle, appropriate firmness when needed, but not in a way that feels unsafe or shaming.
Yes. And so that's, this is a good little segue into kind of talking about boundaries a little bit. And so today we're going to be having a Q&A with Dr. Shell. How do you prefer to be called?
Just call me Stacey. That's so fine. As we're talking about collaborative therapy, I'll talk about the title role thing, but Stacey, perfect. I'd prefer that.
Okay. So Stacey and I are going to be having a Q&A, and of course, if it's going to be very specific about the field of psychology, she'll be answering that. But there is a little caveat, and so we want to make sure that we address that in terms of what kind of questions can be answered.
Yes. So I will only be able to provide sort of general knowledge and talk in generalities. I can't answer specific questions or give personalized advice.
So it has to do with the constraints of the field. Is that right?
Yeah. And I actually think it's about safety as well, because I think there's safety that comes from working one-on-one with someone who knows all of the details in the full picture that just can't be replicated.
No, of course, you don't have enough context, right?
Yeah.
That's good.
I'll do my best to answer questions. Yeah.
Sure. So if anyone has questions as we go, please make sure that you type them into the comments here, and we're going to scroll down, about 30 minutes scrolling through and answering the questions as we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask, for somebody who's never been in therapy, what is therapy? Why do people go to therapy?
Yeah. This is such a good question. And when you sent it to me ahead of time, I was like, I'm going to have to really think about what therapy is, because I think when you're just doing it every day,
Yeah.
I've not stopped and thought about that for a long time. But I think therapy can be lots of things. And particularly if you're working with a therapist who works in a collaborative way, it can sort of be whatever you need it to be or want it to be. So, I mean, generally speaking, you're meeting with someone, a therapist or counselor, and working through and resolving things that are causing problems in your life or that feel difficult. So it might be behavior patterns, emotions that are painful, thought patterns and beliefs, difficulties in your relationships. And for other people, it's more they've received a diagnosis of some kind and they want to work on that specifically.
I see. Right. That makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting. And I'll tell you, the first time I ever went to therapy was after my grandmother passed away in 2012. So she passed away at the end of 2012. So beginning of 2013, I mean, she was like my attachment figure. So it was it was very painful. And prior to that, in my, so I'm Latina, for those of you who don't know, with my name, Brenda Barros Rivera. So I'm Latina. In our community, it isn't the first thing you think about when you're going to get support. The first thing we tend to think about is family and friends. You talk about your issues with family, and that's how you get it resolved. And so it just was a strange idea to go to somebody else who I've never met before, I'm never going to be in contact with. So even the whole idea of you never talk to your therapist outside of the sessions, that was so bizarre to me because like that is not what relationships are like generally. So it was really hard for me to map it on. But what actually helped me was that my twin sister at the time was training to become a therapist. And because she had comfort and she felt comfortable with therapy and that was what she was training, it made me feel more like, okay, it must be okay for me to go and give it a try. So it's just really funny how I can look back. It's been, what year are we? Not even 10 years. And like where I'm at right now mentally in terms of my comfort with the idea of counseling and therapy is so different from where I was at the time, and for me, it was really just, I don't even know what I'm here to, I just know I need help because this grief is overwhelming.
Right. Yeah.
So I didn't even know what the outcome was going to be. I was just like, can you talk to me and help me? I don't know how you can help me, but if you could, that'd be great, and it ended up being a really great experience. And that's my long-term counselor. Whenever I have any crisis, I'll go to her, and so it's off and on. It's just whenever I need extra support. So that to me, what counseling has been, my experience has been really personal support and just, I mean, it's evolved into more. We'll talk about it more as we go on, but it's evolved into this really beautiful, safe, collaborative relationship. I have the utmost respect and I'm even affection, I would say attachment. I really view my counselor, even though she's just like a couple years older than me, I view her as like an attachment figure for me now, and it's just a really beautiful place to be. So for me, it was about grief, and my healing in terms of my grandmother's loss accelerated so much after I started going to counseling. And it had really stagnated prior. So if anyone is on the fence about whether you go to therapy or not, I mean, you have to make a decision. But my experience has been that having gone really helped me reduce the amount of suffering I had been experiencing. So
yeah,
really helpful for that.
and that's actually a really good point that I didn't make, but is very true, that I don't think you have to know what it is that doesn't feel good or what it is that feels painful or what it is you want to work on, because that's part of that collaborative piece is having someone to help you work through that and figure out what it is that you want to do and what you want to work on, or what you want to be different or feel different.
I absolutely agree. I'm getting a lot of hearts here. People are really liking that point. Somebody said therapy changed my life. That's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that. There's been some really great experiences around therapy. I think this is one of those things, like, it also almost goes back to like attachment styles also. I think my style has been a little bit more trying to figure things out on my own. So maybe a little bit more fearful, avoidant maybe is where I would categorize myself. And the idea that somebody would be able to help me to that extent, figure it out, and that I didn't have to figure it out on my own, kind of blew my mind a little bit. Because my counselor was able to just help me put pieces together that would have taken me probably hours worth of processing on my own to try to figure out, so I love what you said. You don't have to go to therapy knowing. You go there, and then your therapist can help you figure it out. So I think that's pretty awesome. Yeah, so let's see. So I wanted to talk a little bit also related to this. There's stigma for a lot of people around therapy, and I think definitely in like the Latin community, some of my friends and followers here have said that even in the African American community, there's some stigma around it because the idea is that you only go to therapy if you're crazy. So tell us why that's not true.
It is not true. Like this is my personal belief, and I'm biased because I am a therapist and because I've gone to therapy and benefited from it. That I think therapy is for everyone. I think none of us get through life without some wounding at a minimum, and much, much more traumatic experiences for lots of people. And I don't think we can't expect ourselves to know always what to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that we're taught in our education systems. There's a bit of a shift, at least here. I know they're trying to incorporate more of that kind of work in elementary school.
That's great.
It's not something we learn how to do. And
Yeah.
I think,
Right, we don't develop the competence for that.
Yeah, and I think that's a big role that therapy plays. Is, to me, the end goal is that someone learns what they need and how they can do that for themselves.
Yes.
And I often say to people, like, I'm trying to work myself out of a job in a way with the person, right? That at some point you've learned the things that will help you for the time being and done some of the healing with a safe person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I kind of think about healing and growth as being sometimes synonymous. So it's almost like what I've actually felt also in therapy is there's been some reparenting. Some of the parts of me that, none of our parents are perfect. And, and they didn't always do things in the best way or didn't take the right approach. And sometimes they just like in the school system, have neglected certain things that probably should have been taught, but they didn't know. So how could they teach us? And so I feel like there were some things that I've learned with my own therapist it's both been the reparenting where I've grown through it. So some of it has been healing, but some of it has really felt more like, I didn't know this. Like, this is new for me. This is actually new patterns that I can actually enact. I think one of the first people to really talk to me, well, yeah, she was not the first one, but one of the first one talking about boundaries was my counselor. She was like, Brenda, with that person, you have to put up a wall. You can't just put up a little measly fence. And that's kind of been the theme of my work now, realizing what people, when people are abusive or they're overly aggressive, you can't just say, no, please, you're hurting my feelings. No, you have to like really make it stop, And so that to me it's a parenting thing. Like I tell my children that now, I tell them like, you can't always set nice boundaries with everybody. Some people, if they cross it too much, you've got to take it an extra step. And so I just really feel like counseling can also be a part of reparenting, of growth and healing. So I agree with you. I think everybody would benefit from going to counseling. I'm a big fan of counseling.
And I do want to acknowledge that the stigma thing is real, and it's unfortunate that it's real, and I hope it's not always the case, and it is. And I know even for me, I experienced that as a therapist going to therapy.
Oh my gosh, I bet.
Right? Which really helped me have compassion for people coming in to see me, to know like how uncomfortable I felt sitting in someone's waiting room being like, what the hell is about to happen? Yeah. What am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that can also help us manage it is like, we don't have to tell everybody in our lives if we're going to therapy, if we're going to feel a stigma.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Everyone listening, you don't have to tell everybody, like you just tell the people who are going to be supportive. And that's it. You're not required or obligated to let like your whole family system or all your friends know, because if they don't know what therapy is about and they're going to think they're like, oh, wow, she's going to therapy, then it's not going to help you and you're not going to want to keep going. So just choose wisely who you tell things to. Okay, let's see. So whenever we're looking for a therapist, what are some of the things that we should look for? So there's different modalities that focus on different things. So what are some of those?
Different modalities. There are more than I could probably name, which is a really cool thing, because it means there are lots of different ways that therapists could work with you. And I think it also makes it feel overwhelming sometimes for people, because how are you supposed to ever know which modality you should be looking for? So, some different ones that are common are cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy. Some other ones would be EMDR. Some different ones. ACT is another one. It's probably just confusing for me to be naming all of them if people don't know what they are. I will say, if anyone doesn't follow Lived Experience Counselor on Instagram, they did a really brilliant series of posts. It might still be going on, actually, on different modalities, and just a very clear description of the different ones.
Okay, so Lived Experience Counseling?
Yeah, counselor.
Lived Experience Counselor. Okay. So what I think what's also important to know is that part of the reason a lot of these modalities exist is because they're trying to address different specific issues, right? Like maybe some of them are more geared for trauma, and others might be more geared for phobias or things like that. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that the intent and the way a lot of these modalities pop up is they sort of start in the academic world where there's research being done. And so they tend to do the research for specific diagnostic categories. And then the idea is that they're evidence-based for those difficulties. And there certainly are some things that we have good evidence for, as far as evidence in the field of psychology research goes, where it makes sense, right? So something like a phobia, for example, CBT is a great approach for that. And it's not the only one, which makes it, I think, confusing for people as consumers of therapy.
Right. One of the questions that came up in my post when I asked if anybody had questions that I thought was kind of important to address, the question had to do with touch in therapy. So the question was a little bit more about, is this okay or not? But I was curious, on your take, what are some of the therapies, I don't know if they fall under psychology, like somatic experiencing or others where touch seems to be more appropriate. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't know that I have a really clear, concise answer on that. But there are some of the more somatic approaches, which I'm not trained in. I'm working on that because I would really like to be. I think those are important approaches that I need to get really specific training in. But more of those, anything that involves sort of body movement stuff might involve touch. There is also, I think it's unclear because there isn't a clear ethical guideline saying no touch ever, or even saying here are the circumstances under which it's okay to have put a hand on someone's shoulder, right? And I can speak for myself as a therapist and some others that I know that it's difficult sometimes to see someone in distress and not want to offer to sit beside them on the couch, or to put a hand on their shoulder. Or I work with lots of kids who run into the room and want to give me a hug when they run into the room, right? So, but I think to me, the most important things would be, one, it's for the client's benefit, it's therapeutic in nature, and they're comfortable with it. And I actually think that it's something therapists need to be asking for informed consent before they do. Because if it's therapeutic in nature, which it ethically should be,
Mm-hmm.
then like any therapeutic strategy, you should be asked for consent before it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Just like very specific consent, like would it feel helpful if I sat beside you
Mm-hmm.
when you're feeling that way, or right now?
Mm-hmm.
To be really clear that they can say no, that's not comfortable. And there are many therapists who just have really clear rules for themselves that there's no touch with clients at all.
Mm-hmm. So they have their own boundaries around that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think the most important thing is if you feel uncomfortable with something, not just touch, but anything happening with a therapist, that's a red flag for you potentially. Like to sort of trust your gut around that. And if you're not comfortable with it, that's all that matters, right? Or if it doesn't feel safe for you, that's all that matters rather than their intention.
Yeah, I think, okay, so let's talk about safety. What does safety look like? What does safety feel like in therapy?
So I think this is tricky for me to answer generally because I think it would be different for every single person. I think that may be subjective, but
Mm-hmm.
I think some general things would be one, feeling like your physical safety is prioritized,
Mm-hmm.
and two, sort of your emotional safety
Mm-hmm.
being prioritized. Physical safety might be, for someone who, if they experience very intense emotions, they start to feel very unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, feeling physically safe would mean having a therapist say, this is what we'll do if that happens, right? Like to have a plan in place that this is what I will do to support you, to help make sure you're safe, to help you re-regulate,
Right.
to have that, in place ahead of time, ideally.
Right, right. So
Um,
active approach. It
yeah,
and it really, I think one of the things that it underlines is the fact that there's a power difference between therapists and clients. And in that sense, a sense of responsibility that therapists have in the therapist client relationship, right? That kind of, the therapist is the one who has to be proactive about the safety of
yeah,
the client. I mean, was that, so it's
yeah,
not the client being worried about the therapist, but the therapist being worried about the client. And
yes. And I just saw someone ask safety for who, the therapist or the client? For the client,
mhm,
for the
safety.
client, like your sense of safety. And yeah, that's part of a therapist's job
Mhm,
to,
mhm,
you know, be initiating those conversations, to be being proactive around that stuff, and to be checking in regularly with people,
mhm.
right? Like, how did that feel today? Am I pushing too hard on this right now? Do you want to talk about this? Is there something, you know what I mean? Like, and to ask directly for feedback as well.
Right. And so one of the things that, can come up for people, and that was actually one of my concerns too. Like I said, going into my first session and with the whole, like, I'm supposed to be talking to my family about this, not to somebody I don't know yet. There is the whole cultural identity and race. It's one of those things that comes up in any relationship. And in a therapeutic relationship, it can come up as well. So what are your thoughts around how somebody might be able to like approach that with their therapist?
Mhm. So, like, my thinking around that is that you should feel um, like you should feel that you can ask specific questions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my Instagram just closed.
Sometimes it shuts down like that. So I'm looking through some of these questions.
There, I'm back.
Oh. So somebody said, will you talk about when do you know the relationship with your therapist is unsafe? I feel like I overstayed and it was a wrong fit from the start.
Yeah, it's a really hard thing to know. I think that some ways, like I was trying to think earlier of some ideas about ways that people could assess for sort of like safety, or what indicators of that might be generally.
Mm-hmm.
It might be things like, um, you know, do I feel like I can share things honestly with this person? Or do I feel um, like I'm shamed or feel invalidated when I share certain things?
Mm-hmm.
It might also be, do I feel like I can give feedback when I'm not comfortable with something, or if something doesn't feel helpful? And also, how do they respond when I do that? Like, are they able to hear me, validate me, see my perspective? Do they take ownership if there's been a rupture of some kind?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is the therapist actually able to say, you're right, I did that, I'm sorry it felt that way for you, let's figure out how I can approach it differently next time.
Right.
To me are things that would be indicators of safety for most people. I don't want to assume for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then even things like, are they following general ethical guidelines? Are they asking you for informed consent? Did they explain confidentiality to you? Do you have a
Mm-hmm.
chance to ask questions about those things?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I've also noticed, even for myself, is, are they on time? Like, things that indicate to me that somebody respects who I am is like, do they respect my time? Do they cut
Yeah.
too early? You know, because I know it's like it's like a 15-minute session, but if they start cutting at 40 minutes, it's like, whoa, you know. So I mean, thankfully, most of my one counselor, I have been with her for all these years off and on, and I've just had the best experiences. But I have had an experience where it wasn't good, and I mentioned this on one of your posts, where there was a webcam and I was not aware of it. And I think it was for training purposes, but I should have been made aware of that at the time. I didn't know. And that same therapist would sometimes show up late or leave early. And those were the kind of things that made me feel, I don't feel like this therapist respects me the way,
Right.
like, I come on time to the sessions, so I'm expecting for the therapist to treat my time as equally valuable. And so I'm not saying that that person was not a good therapist. It just was something that, because time is something that I'm sensitive to in that way, then that was important to me. Right. So maybe there's some people who don't care about that as much. Again, this is why safety also feels like a very personal thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
And I think the other thing that kind of comes up, and a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about it, but the whole idea of transference and countertransference, and where some potential, like romantic feelings for a counselor might show up. And so for one, from what I've read, it's a normal experience for people to feel that, because their counselor, they don't know as much about their therapist, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a blank screen. So they're able to project onto the counselor. I mean, you think about it, you have a counselor somebody who listens to you intently for an hour, is always empathic, is always kind and concerned about you. But of course, it's 1 hour of the week. So it's not as if, so then there's these fantasies of like, oh, I wonder what it would be like if, we were together. And it's like, no one can be like that for like every single day of the week and all those hours with no boundaries in place.
No, I can guarantee you of that.
Yeah.
That's not that way. You know what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
not my ideal therapist self in my real life.
Right? Because that's why those boundaries are in place, to help protect the therapist's ability to be like that. So I want to normalize that, because then there's a lot of, you can just Google it up and there's a lot of stuff. But how is an ethical therapist going to handle this?
Mm-hmm. I think the ethical approach to that is to be open to having a conversation about it. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? That's where safety comes in. That I think for someone to feel that they can share that with their therapist, if it feels safe to, like, you're under no obligation to, of course, but to just be able to hold space for that and to process it and to sort of talk about it, I think quite similarly in the way that you just did, right? Like normalizing why that would make sense given the context, and
Mm-hmm.
also at the same time being really clear about boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and what the therapeutic relationship is and is not and can never be, right? Like those boundaries are there. And that's safety, right? Is saying like, these are the boundaries. This is what this relationship is a therapeutic relationship. And it makes sense that those types of feelings come up for people sometimes. And you just sort of hold the space for that and not be judgmental and process it in a safe way.
Right.
And to also, I think, you know, if that is something that gets in the way of someone being able to get what they need from their therapist, to know that it's okay to change therapists. And I would hope that the therapist would communicate that as well.
Yes, those of you who you have not heard that before, you get to pick whenever you need to move on. You know, like, ideally, if it's collaborative, both people can kind of come to an agreement. But if it's not, you're under no obligation to stay in a therapy or any relationship, but including a therapeutic one, if it doesn't work, you know, for you, if it's not safe for you, or if it's just not a good fit. Because sometimes that's the other thing is like, just because a therapist might be safe, might be a great therapist, they're just not the right fit for you in terms of personality or in terms of their background. They don't understand where you're coming from, so you're having to explain everything, you know. And that is one thing that I will say is that one of the things that I really love. So my therapist's name is Lori. I love Lori, and she is a mom a few years older than me. She has kids, so there was something about that shared experience of being a wife, mom, you know, woman, that was helpful for me. I didn't have to explain how difficult and why I was so exhausted running around after a toddler and you know, almost two toddlers at the time, you know. I didn't have to explain it. So it just so happened that it was my identity at that moment that I needed support with. And so you have to pick somebody that will work, you know, basically fit with you wherever you are in life at that time. You know, I kind of feel like, so there's like the therapist end of it, and then there's the client end of it too, where, you know, to take responsibility for finding somebody who's a good fit and feeling empowered to do so, you know.
Yeah. I actually love the idea of someone used this term in one of the comments on one of my posts last week, like encouraging people to see themselves as consumers of therapy. Right, as opposed to like I'm this person's client and I sort of have to do whatever or be in that role. To actually think of yourself as a consumer where you get to decide what's a good fit for you and what isn't. And I think it's fair game to interview potential therapists ahead of time. And if there's certain things that you want to know about, I think you are free to ask. And there's no guarantee all therapists will be comfortable answering any and all questions. And then you can decide, is that something I need my therapist to be able to give me a clear answer on? Right. So maybe this is not the right fit.
And so one of the things that, you know, I think about a lot, it's, you know, most institutions have some kind of protection, right? And I think about them like on freeways or highways, that there's the guards, the barriers, you know, so that somebody doesn't careen off the freeway down into a ditch, right? But before that barrier, there's like the yellow line where the shoulder is at. And I kind of think that the yellow line represents our internal boundaries, and then the institutions are their guidelines and their ethical standards are the rail. Right? So we have to be okay with that guardrail. We don't have to let it get to that point, right? We have to listen to our own internal boundaries, because one of the things that I've realized in my own experience in my PhD program, with the abuse I experienced there, and some other situations I've had, even like at the doctor's office or with my psychologist, the one who I mentioned had these, you know, just some strange things, is that sometimes the institutional safeguards are not enough for your own protection. And this is where we have to be able to be advocates for ourselves. And that doesn't make it right that anything happened to us. Okay, I'm not saying that it's okay. What I'm saying though is that once the damage is done, it's hard to undo that. So like what the boundaries can help us do is prevent damage from happening, because that is the protective buffer so that we don't become traumatized by these experiences. But this does take us showing up for ourselves, you know? And so that's why I think boundaries are so important. I realize a lot of people have difficulty with them because there's some trauma background, or they just were never modeled it. But I would say boundaries are probably one of the priorities, because it helps keep us safe. so that we don't have to rely on institutional, you know, that those things, yeah, a punitive action to somebody who misbehaves isn't going to undo the damage you experience.
Yeah.
You know? So what are, like, if somebody does want to take that route though, like, what does that look like? Let's say that somebody experienced something in a therapist's office that was clearly a violation of the ethical guidelines of the American Psychological Association, or whichever other psychological association they're under. What would a person do?
Yes. So one thing that I will say is that at least here, at least our code of ethics for psychologists in Canada are available online. So I'd actually encourage people, like, you can access that and read it. Our college, our licensing board here in Ontario is called the College of Psychologists of Ontario, which is always confusing for people because the word college sounds like it's a school. It's actually our licensing body here. And they have a ton of resources for the public, PDF downloads and stuff about ethical guidelines, boundaries that you can, take the time to. I would even suggest, if you have the time and ability, to look at some of that prior to starting therapy, just so you have a sense of what is okay and not okay. Although I will say you should not have to do that. And that is, that's on the therapist. And I also know that not all therapists always act ethically at all times.
Right.
So, yeah, I just don't want to suggest that burden or that work is on the consumer.
Have to be.
Person. And you are able to do that if it's something you want to do. That information is publicly, like, it's available to the public. If you want to take an action, like, one thing I can tell you for sure is that our licensing body works for the public, not for us as psychologists. Like, they are not there. They obviously support us in lots of ways, but their job is to protect the people that we work with first and foremost. Like, they're not out to protect us if we do something that we should not be doing or act unethically. Like, that's their role. Where I don't know if it's true there, but here we're considered a regulated health profession. So there's legislation in place, there are laws. In addition to the ethics code is a psychology thing. The legislation is legal stuff.
Wow.
Okay. Legislation. And that's, I would assume, true there as well.
Yeah, probably. I don't even know. I'd have to ask. That might be the case. But it is good to know. I suspect that the ethics boards for psychologists here also have, a lot of stuff online for people who want to look that up. I think it just feels like a nice safeguard to know what is there, what's not. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those rules on those books are not going to protect you in that moment. So that's why you have to, like, come in as an informed, empowered consumer.
Yes, I think that's so important.
Yes.
And I wish it wasn't the case. And
I know, but it is, and that's in any institution, educational institution as well. There's a lot of institutions where you have to go in looking out for yourself, knowing what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with, and just, like, empowering yourself to say, no, I don't like this. I'm gonna walk out, And so, yeah, super, super important. Let's see. So, and I also want to make sure to tack on to ask a question that somebody posed. So the question had to do with, this was a white American, well, not white American, maybe Canadian, but a white man who said that he felt in therapy that whenever he would talk about feeling, in a sense, oppressed by being compared to people who came from really well-to-do families, so he described his family as being very poor. And I mean, he said that he felt it was an unfair comparison, and so that the same people who oppressed people of color oppressed, his family as well. So basically, it's the whole racial identity thing. And so he felt kind of shamed in therapy for feeling this way. And I feel like this is a little dicey because on the one hand, maybe the person who he was talking to they really want to be cognizant of what's going on in the world. And the fact is, a lot of people of color are being hurt and have historically been hurt. And yet, he does not view himself as having benefited from that oppression. And so he feels it's unfair to be labeled as such. And so as I was reading this, I was thinking, why would that be a place in therapy to be labeled that way anyway? So I'm curious, like, what you might generally suggest.
Yeah. So I can say, as someone who has personally, like, my own views about that, that even if we look at, like, we could use the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists as an example of this. So I actually wrote them down because I was thinking this, it's just good to have them. So the first one, which is the one that always has to be given the most weight, is respect for dignity of persons, and in particular, the person that you're working with individually. We also have responsibility to society as psychologists in terms of social justice and talking about things like racism and violence and all of those things. And I think as a consumer of therapy, if you want if what you need is for your experience to be seen and heard, even if that's a starting point, right? That's sort of what therapy is. And not all therapists will be able to do that, right? Because we all have, like I said, like, I have my own personal thoughts and feelings, very strong feelings about some of this stuff. And so it's also about knowing, as a therapist, if you're not going to be able to be unbiased in working with someone, right? Like, if you don't think that you can hold space for that person's reality, then that's a thing to acknowledge. And for someone who is finding they're not getting that from their therapist, to know that, I think it's okay to want a therapist who can validate your lived experience. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's really what it comes down to is, do you feel supported?
Yeah.
Anyone should go to therapy and then have to fight to explain their own identity. And I don't know what the context was. He just provided this question. But generally speaking, I was thinking, I don't want to have to go talk to somebody and then have to defend the way I feel and then explain all the different things I experienced that made me feel this way. I want to be able to speak to somebody who kind of gets it, with a little bit of context, gets it. And then I don't have to do all that. Because then you're having to do extra emotional labor.
Totally. Yeah. Which is not something you should have to do in therapy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So let me make sure I didn't miss any questions. Okay, so I think I got all my questions. Let me just make sure I didn't miss any of the questions here. And if you want to scroll through and see if you miss any questions. Oh, somebody said they have a hard time finding a therapist that understands narcissistic abuse within the family. Narcissism, I think, is a dicey one. Like, I've seen part of it is like there's some resistance towards the label, I think, because there's a desire to not, what do you call it, stigmatize people, which if the client is the one who has a label, I get that. But from the perspective of somebody who's experienced narcissistic abuse, like, I've noticed the same thing myself. And I actually made a post about this, that label seems to really, at least in my experience, seems to throw people off a lot. Like, my own twin sister, who is a social worker, she has her PhD in social work, and she's a therapist. She had a lot of resistance towards the label when I was telling her what I was experiencing at work. And then this is how, through this conversation, I realized there's a gap between what the DSM says and what the lay literature says. And so, like, somebody co-opted the term. And, so in the lay literature, it just really means, I think, what is very close to reality, the whole smear campaigns, flying monkeys, the bullying, the extreme abuse. that isn't captured in the DSM, you know? And so looking for somebody who understands this, like what would be the terminology to use when you're looking for a therapist who can get this? What would you say?
I find, so I'll just say as a therapist, I find labels really, they can be tricky to navigate, because you're right, there is difference between the DSM, the literature, the way it's used just by people in general, different labels and terms, right? Um, so I think, like, I always sort of try to think about being descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, if you can describe, and again, this is putting the work on um, the consumer, but or finding a therapist who can help you put words to it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's so important because, you know, Stacey, I've written a lot about my own experience, which is what launched my desire to talk about safe relationships because, and just being empowered.
Mhm.
And it's just, it kind of is strange to me that I was going through counseling at the time that I was going through this abusive relationship with my supervisor, my former dissertation chair. And I actually started going to counseling at the university in order, this was like a misguided way to do it, but it was like, if I can get support through this oppression, it's like, I'll go get beat up psychologically, then come to counseling and get support, then come back. And so I could get through the program. That was my idea. It did not work, y'all. That's not the way it's supposed to work, but I tried. And never was it described as abuse. It was described as gnarly, you know, and I walked in and I sobbed. It wasn't like I was, you know, it was very raw, but it was never described that way. So this is where I feel like it would have been, I think, had I been seeing Lori, my counselor, who I had been seeing all these years, you know, she would have been able to pick up on it right away. How well she would have given it. I'll have to ask her next time I see her. I'm like, what would you have called that? But even in past conversations, she's been like, Brenda, that's toxic. That's not good for you. She'll like call it right out instead of letting me wallow in trying to figure out why something isn't working for me, you know? So I kind of feel like there is some sense of like, this sounds like you feel abused. This sounds like you're being
Yeah.
gaslighted. This sounds, you know? So
Yeah.
I don't know what the proper terminology would be for that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky. And I also think therapists have different styles. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, that our training's not standardized, and every program is different. And we have different training experiences and different supervisors, and we're all also humans with our own traits and quirks and, egos and all of that stuff. So I think everyone's got a bit of a different style, and there are definitely therapists who sort of hold back around that, like labeling things like that. And there are therapists who will say, that's not okay. Or like, do you know that that's not okay? It sounds like you feel like that's really harmful. You know what I mean? And some people need that, right? Some people need their therapist to jump in and be really clear and direct and sort of like advocate when they're not able to do that for themselves.
Yes, I think it's especially important in the context of an abusive relationship because you're already feeling like you're in a whirlwind. You don't even know what's happening when you're in the middle of it. And it's really funny to me. I'm not funny, because ironic maybe is a word, that I was trained as a domestic violence advocate in my late teens. So I was aware of the cycle of abuse. And when I was in the middle of it, even though it wasn't a romantic relationship, it was a work. I mean, I think that's part of what kind of blew my mind. It's like, can this really happen in a work relationship? Like this, I've never heard of anything like this. And it wasn't until I told one of my cohort members, I'm like, is this happening? And he was like, you sound like you're in the cycle of abuse. And this guy doesn't even read about this stuff. So it just took me a few descriptions to say, and he was able to, and I could not pick up on it because I was in the middle of it, And so I think it would have been very helpful for me, my therapist to have said, this is not okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
You you're experiencing a lot of harm, and I don't know what the words would be, because I get the sensitivity around, and I guess maybe what I'm trying to say here is, for those of you who are hearing this conversation, if that's what you need, you got to find a therapist who's willing to say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
There's snoring back there before. I don't know if everyone heard her. Yeah. And I also I think at the same time, for someone else, having a therapist say that's abusive or that's toxic might feel terrible,
Yes.
might feel incredibly shaming, or it might make you never want to come back to see that therapist again, which is what, right? I think it's also just a reality is that ruptures sometimes happen, right? Like, we're fallible.
Yes.
Right? And I think, I don't want to use the term like a good therapist, but I think a really aware therapist who's working hard to be collaborative will assume that they're gonna mess up sometimes, right? And are honest with that, about that, with people, and are willing to repair that when it happens. You know, if the person wants to repair it. If they don't, that's okay too. You don't have to feel like you have to go back and repair things with a therapist if it felt not okay for you. But
yeah, no, that's a really good point. Some people are not going to want to hear it that way. So if you're the kind of person who does need to hear that, it's important to probably talk to the therapist ahead of time. Part of the interview, it's like, how do you feel about these labels? Like, I kind of need somebody who's willing to call it what it is. I need clarity. I feel confused about this, So it's a process. It's never going to be perfect, but if you know ahead of time, those are the kind of questions that you can ask.
Totally, yeah. And I think it's sort of similar to the early attachment relationships, which, the repair is the most important thing there.
Yes.
Right? With the young kids, that to know you're not going to do it perfectly, but it's about how do you then get attuned again and repair it and do differently the next time.
Yes. And I would say also the micro ruptures. Like, I almost feel like if the rupture is too big, like that can also be really detrimental. So this is where I think the fit comes in. Like, if you, I feel like with Lori, I can honestly say in all these years, I don't think she's ever done anything wrong, but that's because I fit well with her. I'm sure she could probably say, oh yeah, this is probably, I didn't catch this or whatever. But from my perspective, because everything is so steady, and she's I don't know, such a good fit for me. Like, the kind of things, if she has done anything, it just isn't something I even remember. It's like a little blip, But if, like with my former therapist, I'm sure he's great for many people, but those things actually stand out in my mind more because I just think we were not as good of a fit for whatever reason, And so, so I think finding that fit and empowering ourselves to find people who will really work for us from day one. And I think one of the signals for me, when I feel safe, so everyone's different, is like what kind of pattern starts coming up in your relationship. Like, if it's somebody who either you don't feel safe with or something's not a good fit, do you tend to start going to fawning mode where you're like more preoccupied with what your therapist thinks about you than or how they feel versus how you feel? I mean, your feelings should be centered as a client in the therapeutic relationship, Or do you get extra defensive? Like, are you starting to behave in patterned ways in that relationship? That just might be something for me that I look for to help me know if I'm feeling safe or not, right? So just everyone has to know what their own cues are.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of like weird to say this about the field of psychology, but I think we're finally, not we, but like the academic part of our field is finally starting to research and take really seriously the role of the therapeutic relationship. I mean, like, you sent me that really great series of meta-analyses where they were like, oh, the therapy relationship is at least as equally as important as the techniques used. And I was like, no kidding. Like, those of us doing therapy are aware of this.
Yes.
And that it's at least as important. And the rest, is less important if you're not building that really safe relationship.
Yes. Once that base is there, like, that's just kind of the point of departure. And if
Mhm.
it's the therapeutic base so much, I almost feel it's like the ventral vagal of a relationship. That's like my analogy. The ventral vagal of relationship is the attachment, you know, the bond there.
Yeah.
Listen, do you have any other questions that popped up for you there?
I had mentioned something which I thought was good to address. Um, I think it was after we were speaking about sort of the idea of shopping around for different therapists or
Mm.
interviewing therapists or, you know, finding someone's not a good fit and then moving on. Someone just mentioned that that sounds expensive. And I think that's just a good thing to acknowledge
Yeah.
that it is. And that's like a major issue with access
Yeah.
to services, especially psychological services, that not everyone has the ability to switch therapists or to do a couple of sessions with someone and then start fresh with someone new.
It's very true.
Yeah.
It's very true. I think his name, and he wrote a book on healing from CPTSD. Pete Walker, I believe. You know, he talks about, he like has a website he recommended that gave you a list of therapists. But anyway, he kind of talked about one of the things that you can do. Many therapists are willing to do like a 5-minute phone consultation just to gauge fit, and that might be a way to not have to do multiple sessions, because it's true. It's, especially if there's no health coverage, health insurance coverage,
Right.
that's pretty pricey. Yeah.
It is. And I would encourage people to ask that. Like if someone asks me, can we have a phone conversation? I have some questions for you before we meet for an intake. I'm always willing to do that, like free of charge. That's not something, I know everyone's got their own boundaries and stuff around that, but I think that that's just like in the spirit of being collaborative and also empowers the person to feel like they have the right to ask me questions and want to know my background and my training and how I work with people and, you know.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, we're down to our hour and it's gonna cut us off here on Instagram. But Stacey, thank you so much for being here. This is such a productive, great conversation. I'm gonna be saving this. We're gonna be posting it on our pages. And if you want to check it out again, please make sure to do so. So you can find her at Dr. Stacey Schell, Schell, for those of you who are on my page, and make sure you go check her page out, follow her, and read her amazing posts on collaborative therapy. So much for being here, Stacey.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Okay. Yay.
Hey, are you going to save yours to your live or just post it?
So no, I'm going to delete this one and then I'm going to save the, so we're still recording. I'm still recording. Let me stop the recording here.